back to another episode of GGU Presents. This is our Back to the Basics talk show, I guess you can call it. We've been doing this for over a year, and it's been getting better and better. I'm really looking forward to talking with our guest today. My name's Marc Singer. I am the Dean of the School of Undergraduate Studies here at Golden Gate University. Welcome to all of you. Hope you brought your lunch. Feel free to eat while we're talking. So today we're going to be talking about cross-cultural negotiations and communications. And our guest today is Christopher Lynch, who is an instructor with us at Golden Gate University. Christopher Lynch is a global business thought leader and founder of the International Business Accelerator, also known as IBA. You'll hear us talking about that throughout our conversation. The IBA works with U.S. companies to expand cross-border business, as well as foreign investors establishing operations in the U.S. market. Chris is an economist by training, and he was a career U.S. Foreign Service officer, but apparently he's not going to be able to give us any state secrets, right? We talked about this, and there's nothing like that I'm allowed to ask about. All right, but Chris, I've dealt with economic and business policy issues in Washington, D.C., and also at 5 U.S. embassies throughout Europe and Latin America. His last post before retiring was as U.S. Consul General to Hamburg in Germany. He's been an instructor, an adjunct professor of international business at Golden Gate University since 2005. And it probably goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. He speaks fluent German and Spanish, and I don't. So we'll be conducting this conversation in English. I hope that's all right with everyone. Welcome, Chris. It's great to have you here today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Glad to present.
Yeah, this is great. So I know we're going to have some slides in a couple minutes, but before we get into that, I'd just love to know what got you interested in this area of cross-cultural negotiations?
Yeah, well, first of all, being a career foreign service officer, that was sort of part of our bread and butter. My first job out of college was at the U.S. Trade Representative, and that's the group that does trade negotiations for the United States. At the time, we were all in a frenzy about Japan, and I think if you take a lot of the rhetoric that's going on about China today, pull out the word China, put the word in Japan, that you have that. But that sort of it was sort of my first exposure to things, because the head of the organization, which has the rank of ambassador, although it's in the White House, came back from a meeting in Japan, said, we've had this tremendous breakthrough. They were trying to get aluminum baseball bats into Japan at the time. And he said, we're going to be opening up the market. And they've agreed to all these things. And then time went by and more time went by. And finally asked one of my friends there, hey, what's going on? And he said, well, you have to realize that, in Japanese, hi means more like I copy than I agree with you, than the term yes. And he said, there's a really good book that you should read. It's called Never Take Yes for an Answer, The Art of Negotiating with the Japanese. And so it was, to me, it sort of was that first thing that really brought out the fact that, yes, you're sitting down, you're talking about issues, generally you understand things in your own language, but the whole process has a very different feel than a traditional negotiation.
Oh, interesting. So it's about very much more than just the words that you use, as we'll talk about, right?
Yeah.
Wow, so interesting. And that's probably going to vary from country to country, culture to culture.
Yep.
Amazing. So I know you've brought some slides which will help us with the visuals. So, and by the way, if folks are listening to this on the podcast, we'll try to describe the slides to you, but you can't see them. Chris, if you have those slides, why don't you put those on the screen right now, if you would. And great. All right. And so this will sort of help us through some of what we're going to be talking about, right? So
yeah.
So let me see. Why don't I just start with a couple of questions that I had for you as I've been thinking about this. This is a subject that I don't know very much about, but I know it's increasingly of importance for our students, for our businesses, and government as well, right? So I guess what my first question for you is probably just to build on what we were just talking about, is negotiating in an international context really that different from a local negotiation? Are there, and I guess what I'm thinking about is, well, of course, there, as we were just saying, it'll vary from culture to culture, but are there basic rules that apply regardless of the differences among parties?
Yeah, you're still trying to do the same, achieve the same end result. You're trying to come up to an agreement, and that means that you have to go through a process. You have to understand what the other side wants, what their particular needs are, and that the reason that they're sitting there across the table from you or on the other side of the Zoom screen. Then you have to talk about the process. You go through a process, and usually it's mutual concessions where you try and zero in on some eventual goal that you are there. Part of the process too is also understanding what the person who's actually negotiating with, what their range of ability to make decisions is. Are they the final decision maker? Are they one, fairly far down the decision tree? And those are all sort of basically the same issue, and you want to work through that, and you want to come up with an agreement at the end. The famous win-win. That's what an ideal sort of outcome from any negotiation is.
That makes sense. All right. So there are some common things here, right? Both sides want to come away with something that they're successful at, and where they've been successful.
Mhm.
And as I'm seeing here, but that isn't just what can I win, but it also requires, as you suggest here, mutual concessions, right? And
Yeah. The one thing you don't want to do is just to come out where you get everything. I mean, you can sometimes force that through. That's usually a one-off. And you want to do repeat business with your
yeah,
customers. And so that means that they feel like they got a good deal. They got a good value in the process too. And that's ultimately what you're looking for.
So you're building like a sustainable long-term relationship.
Right,
then,
right.
is the goal.
Say if you're dealing with a supplier in China, that you are be able to do that, you're able to not only arrive at a price, you understand where they're coming from, and you understand what it is that they need over time, so that when not only you have the current order, but you have orders months, years from now, and so forth, so that you build up this relationship. One of the things I mentioned in my international business classes is that international business is still fundamentally a business of relationships. Ultimately, you have to build relationships over time, and that's it's hard, as we'll get into it later on. One of the key issues going with different cultures is a matter of trust, and you build that trust by building relationships, and you do that by having successful discussions, negotiations, and building on those for the future.
So that trust is universal, I would assume.
Yeah.
That's one thing you can count on.
Yeah.
So all right, that's good. That's interesting. So this is what's really fascinating to me. What kinds of differences should one consider? It's not just what people are saying, as we were saying, right? There's got to be so much more to it, right? And there are common pitfalls as well with not understanding that.
Yeah, these are just listing up here on this slide. For those who don't see it, it's 6 areas I'm talking about: body language, hierarchy, food, socializing, gender roles, and stereotypes. But for example, with body language, I chose, there's a picture up there of this man making the OK sign, okay, which is wonderful in most cultures, except, for example, if you're in Brazil, that's not a polite sign that you would be making to somebody. There are so many other sorts of things that you can do, not only with your hands. In many South Asian and other cultures, that your left hand is, you don't touch food with your left hand. That's your potty hand. There are issues there with feet not showing the soles of your shoes. For those who remember, when George W. Bush went to Iraq near the end of the Iraq engagement over there, he was doing a press conference, and a reporter from an Iraqi threw his shoe at him. And that's just sort of the ultimate insult, to show the soles of your feet. So things that may not seem all that important to you suddenly become very important. You just don't want to do that. And another thing I always talk about too is eyes. We have this real emphasis in our business culture of being able to look somebody in the eyes. And that tells us, oh, we can trust that person, and or they're being deceptive or whatever. And in other cultures, maybe that's not the case. There's certain cultures where you don't look people in the eyes, particularly if you have differences in gender roles. So that doesn't tell you anything. When Putin looked Bush in the eyes and Bush said, oh, I thought, I saw somebody I could deal with. No, you were seeing a trained KGB officer looking at you and, giving you the impression that you were able to deal with him. It's also too, even within our own language, within our own culture, in terms of somebody, for example, who has Asperger's. I don't know how many of you saw that when Elon Musk was on Saturday Night Live about 6 weeks ago.
Yeah.
It was, he said, well, I'm Elon Musk and I'm out here and I'm playing the role of somebody who is playing a human being. Why? Because with Asperger's, looking somebody in the eye is difficult. So, but it doesn't tell you anything about Elon Musk at that point. So you have to sort of sit back, take your preconceptions and pull them out so that you're not making judgments solely on that.
Interesting. So that's it. I think you bring up a good point, which is this is not just about international differences, right? There are the ones within one's own culture, within different aspects of a single culture, that sort of thing, that where you'd need to know how to. It's more than just reading the room. It's understanding that the cues that you'd be looking for in one place wouldn't necessarily be the same. Yeah,
and it's also too. It's another thing is that we as North Americans tend to have a invisible bubble around us. It's basically about the length of your hand out from your chest, your arm out, and that's sort of like, you don't get much closer than that. And if you get closer than that, it's something that's more intimate or it's more threatening.
Right. So personal space is different.
Personal space, yeah. And it's in a lot of Asian cultures, it's much further. In some cultures, like in Russia, it's very, very close. People come up, talk to you. I had that a lot in Latin America, and I had to really learn not to step back from, because I didn't want to be insulting to them, but I felt uncomfortable because my space had been somehow violated, but I didn't want to, you had to unlearn that particular aspect.
Yeah, but if it's somebody in your own culture, that's just a close talker, right? And that's
it's fine, or somebody. And there may be times when that works. There's other times I really feel uncomfortable with this. So
yeah. I'm also interested in this idea about food. You mentioned food and socializing, which often go together. I mean, the whole thing about table manners, is crucial to get right, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I have this particular image up here of this is some Arab food, but we have the whole fish there and the fish head. Doesn't bother me. Some people get really grossed out about it, but you have to learn to do that, particularly when you're visiting the other country. You're on their turf, and it's learning to do that. One of the things at the State Department, they have what we jokingly refer to as knife and fork school, where you learn how to deal with these kinds of different kind of food issues, taboos, etc. And there, one of the jokes about it is that if you are at a Bedouin feast out in the desert, they slaughter a camel, and that the guest of honor gets the camel's eye. And if you're the guest of honor, you sit there, you put it in your mouth, you pop it, you swallow it and say, that was delicious. Thank you for that honor. I don't know if I could do that. I don't know if I could do that.
Exactly. That's interesting. I mean, but it sounds like what you're saying is that one should try hard to do it.
Right, right. And to be appreciative, and there are certain things that may not. There's some cultures that take particular joy in trying to get the guests to feel uncomfortable by presenting them some weird food or something like that.
Oh, really?
But it happens there. Now there's the whole thing there is knowing to do that, and what food to do there. Some cultures have a lot of emphasis on alcohol. And what do you do if you're not a drinker? Well, one of the things I always recommend is just say to somebody, oh, I have a medical allergy to it, or I'm taking medicines right now and I can't do it. It kind of gets you out there. I have had several evenings of dealing with my Finnish friends, and I lost badly in the alcohol consumption race. It's something that you have to do there. Now, in terms of the socializing, I put down here in this lower left-hand corner a picture. That's the picture of the Hamburg City Hall, the Rathaus. And they have this great big formal banquet room. And I've been to many events there. And it was about a week after I came to post, we had Richard Daley in, for then mayor of Chicago. And he was, Hamburg and Chicago were sister cities. So they had this great big event, and there I am, brand new to town. And there you are sitting up in front of this large group, and it was literally that full of people. And, you had a large, event, plates sitting in front of you with forks going out this way and knives and spoons going out the other, and up and down and so forth. And just learning how to navigate that. Socializing may be very informal. It's going out to, a bar. It may be going out to playing golf, whatever it is. So the socializing, very important part of any negotiation, any sort of cross-border business. That's the part that's relationship building. But it's knowing what's expected you, what isn't. In parts of Latin America, I would be very much invited into people's homes, and it was a great honor, to be out at their ranch on the weekends. You take Spain there, on the other hand, was a place that is very traditionally, you would think they would have the same cultures. Yeah. But I was never invited into a Spaniard's house in the 3 years that I was there. We did lots of things at restaurants, and it was a different kind of social setting, but we didn't do that. So understanding what is a part of the socializing process, what's the honor, what you can do to help build those kinds of relationships.
Is it, and this will seem like a strange question, is it okay to ask your hosts like what's okay?
Yeah. I think generally what it is that you need to have I always call a local interpreter. It's somebody that you're dealing with locally who understands the local culture, and kind of ask them. There's a resource at the end that we'll talk about that you can get some of this information. But yes, it's understanding what is expected of you, what's not. Are you being given a warm welcome, or is it something that's rather, formal or something that's going through the motions, but not really a genuine social event? Yeah,
makes sense. All right, interesting. I'm realizing as we're talking about this that even the process itself, it's not just these sort of like what food you're eating or when you should drink or what, but getting back to the question about the negotiations themselves, even that process has to be part of what you consider in starting off negotiations, right? I would assume you can't even take for granted that they'll follow the same steps that we would follow, right? Are there things like that you have to think about as you're going through this, whether that's involving food
I think so too. I mean, there's some things that are the same, some things that are different. As with any negotiation, you have to understand the person you're negotiating with, their goals. And there are certainly corporate goals, what they are there representing. but they also have a personal agenda. Do they want to advance in the company? One of the issues that gets very complicated in a lot of smaller countries is that there are family relationships. And so they not only have an obligation with the family, to the company, but also to the family. And many times they're one and the same. So that makes things very complicated too, in terms of what it is they can offer, or what it is that they, how much you can do in terms of personal, personal outcomes. Probably the biggest difference is in the negotiating style, and that's something that a lot of business people don't recognize. It's, for example, those of you had the fun of going to like a bazaar in a Arab country, the souk. And you go in there, and the fun part is the negotiating. They'll come in and say, this carpet, oh, it's worth, $1,000. And you kind of know it's worth about $200. Well, you offer 50. And, you work your way down, and you come out to a mutually agreed level. And you kind of both know, and you have to know ahead of time what the expended outcome is. But you're not going to be, you're expecting that. That's part of the process. Now, with my German colleagues, if you would come in with something that was very high above what was being expected, that was taken as something of not good faith. You're not serious. Okay, that would shut down a negotiation. So there's these opening offers that you have to do, and those really vary. There's a lot of cultural elements to them, some strategy, but a lot of cultural elements. There's a second element is timing. So the timing is how it goes through the process. In our North American culture, we tend to look at we start off the negotiation, we get down to business, we go through the process, you do some initial exploratory discussions, and then you go into a part of where you're actually doing the mutual concessions. Okay, that goes along pretty orderly. In other cultures, that there's a lot of preliminary discussion, getting to know each other and so forth, and it's not going to go anywhere. There are for a while, and there are other cultures where they deliberately withhold concessions to the end. This is certainly the case with the Soviets in the United States. A lot of my colleagues, older colleagues who dealt a lot with the Soviets, would say that, they would come in and say, they would be this discussion, and then we'd offer a concession. There'd be no response, and we'd offer another concession, there'd be no response. Well, by the time you got to the end point where you're concluding thing, we had few cards left to play, and they had pretty much of a full deck to play in terms of concessions. So that is also to understanding that technique. Also, one of the other frustrating things there is with a lot of cultures is that everything has to be referred to the top boss. With Japan, everything had to go back to Tokyo, from the smallest detail, and it would take time to come back. Sometimes they would use that as to their advantage in terms of negotiating. And sometimes it just was frustrating, but you have to understand that particular approach there.
Oh, all right. So, and this is going to vary again from place to place and culture to culture, and the context of what you're negotiating about, I assume also.
Yeah. I mean, some places you're going to have a very, hard approach, soft approach. A hard sell may work in one culture, won't work in others. When I was actually just first starting at teaching at Golden Gate, I was living in the Bay Area, and I had a client had a mining technology, and I had previously been in Chile, and I knew all the top people in the mining industry down there, but brought them down there, and it was really a significant opportunity. I told them ahead of time, take your time, they will go things slowly. I think they want to get to know you. And he came in with a typical US American hard sell. Okay. And it didn't go anyplace. And afterwards, I leave that. I get a call from one of my friends who was very high up in the government. Said, "Hey, what's going on with these guys? They really blew it," and they did blow it. They lost probably an opportunity in the hundreds of millions of dollars because they didn't follow through and just listen to that, not try and do the hard sell.
Interesting. Wow. I should just mention in passing, we've got a couple of questions that folks have posted in the Q&A. If others have questions, by all means, put them there. I'm sure there's a lot to cover. And so, yeah, just make sure to put those in the Q&A. Thanks. And actually, I might go to one of those now because it was something that I was thinking about as well, which is, do you have a sense of, do non-American negotiators learn something similar about reaching a win-win with us?
Well, I know my colleagues in other diplomatic services used to get similar training. There are other places that offer that. I think the concept of win-win is something made more explicit in ours, but I think people sort of generally understand the concept of the negotiation. So if they're good at what they do, they will either explicitly or a lot of them sort of instinctively will take some of the, under advisement, some of the adjustments that are needed for cultural differences. I know that, sometimes, my colleagues on the other side would be, in other countries, from the host country, would be very skilled in doing that process.
I see. But I guess part of it, to me, that's, I don't know if this is what our questioner was asking, but did you ever feel like you were being handled? Like, oh, Americans are going to do this. I'm ready for that.
Right. And that sort of gets back to stereotypes. We all have our stereotypes about what other people are, what we think about. People have stereotypes of us. A lot of the common perception of how you would describe an American businessman in general terms or in abstract terms would come out to sometimes pretty close to a description of a stereotypical Texan. Okay, very loud and brash and aggressive and so forth. When that's not the case, and sometimes you can use that to your advantage by playing off that stereotype or playing opposite the stereotype.
No, interesting. Yeah, but I guess in a diverse culture like ours, right, there isn't going to be a one size fits all approach. I would imagine. Yeah.
No.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Are there? I'm looking at this thing about concluding the deal. I imagine there are differences in how people agree on terms and conclude deals, not just the process itself, but how they know when it's over or that they've gotten what they needed.
It helps. Well, that, as with any negotiation, you have to prepare yourself ahead of time. You have to know what your eventual goal is, what's your maximum, what's your minimum that you're willing to accept, and so forth. And having established those, when you're reaching that point, there's another layer there, and that's you have to confirm the agreement that you're actually agreeing on. It's sort of like never take yes for an answer. That you have dispute resolution mechanisms built into your contracts. And there are various ways to do that. The best one is obviously to get into the US California court system. We're actually a very good place for lots of international businesses like to use that, or our reference law. But there are international conventions if that doesn't work. But you have to do that because, again, you have distances, you have different legal systems, different interpretations, and so you have to have these dispute resolution things. And then another one there, which is sort of related to that one panel I have up there, is language. What's the English? Okay, terms that are used in British English or in Indian English are used differently, and your lawyers can help you work through that, but you have to make sure that you're talking the same language, or that you may think that what is being said in the other language, the other person is thinking and then translates it into English, because most of the time you'll be doing that in English, the negotiation, not always. But are you actually referring to the same concept?
Hmm.
To the same.
That reminds me of something. I was working with some colleagues in Australia and New Zealand, and we were at a meeting, and one of them said, "Oh, I'd like to table this motion."
Mhm.
And I thought, all right, we'll put it off for another day. And they said, no,
Right.
no, that means we're talking about it now.
Right.
It's on the
Yes.
table.
Yes.
Yeah. So there's even within like sometimes thinking that you all speak the same language can be exactly the problem,
Right. So you have to go through that at the end. Your contracts have to take that into account, make sure that they're reviewed, and make sure your attorneys, whoever are they're reviewing them, actually understand that too.
Oh, interesting. So this gets to another question that one of our folks has posted, which is the question of trust. So how do you handle the verification of promises to build a relationship? I mean, of course, there's having it written, but are
Right.
there other approaches to that? Because you don't want to have to write down everything, or do you?
Again, it's different legal systems. The common law approach that's in the English former British colonies is one that's where a lot of things have to be spelled out. In the ones which have what we have a more civil code, which is the Code Napoleon, the Napoleonic Code. There's a lot of things are already in law, and you simply refer to that. So it's probably good to be over specifying rather than under specifying in some of these. But that helps one way to build trust. The other issues are other issues with international business. The course that I'm teaching now in international business this week, we're talking about foreign exchange. So it's how do you how do you then, for example, guarantee payments? How do you make sure that your products will be delivered on time? A lot of it's communication, and certainly now with more rapid communications, these kinds of issues are not as to the fore as they were previously.
I see.
But again, it's trying to as much as possible to understand the other party, understand what it is that they want, what they're about. Some places, you can bring in a lot about the family, others are more guarded and so forth. But to more the extent that you can talk about things that are in common, to know the soccer teams that they may be following, we're not as aware of that generally. There's a lot of soccer fans in the US, but football generally, it's something you can always talk about. Or maybe somebody's interested in tennis, or they're obviously politics and religion get always difficult.
Yeah, you got to be always, even here.
But you find those things that are common, or talk about their language or their experiences with the US, whatever. That builds trust over time.
I see. I can imagine, though, a situation in which somebody might feel offended when you say, "Oh, let's put in place a system for verifying this, the terms," or my.
Well, you can always blame it on somebody else. You can say for the corporate procedures, this is what my lawyer thinks. It's saying, I know we have this here. My lawyer thinks we do it.
Oh, you're right. I do that now, so that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Okay, that good example. So another thing I'm thinking about in these terms is the question of emotion. Like, what role would emotion play in this kind of setting? I imagine that's also sort of culturally bound in a lot of ways.
Yeah, you have to understand what kind of emotion is it's normal to show in the other culture. That's one part of it. Some cultures are, the whole question about face and not showing emotions.
Right, not
so
showing.
it comes back again to with a lot of these, it's not going with your gut instinct. Okay, It means pulling back. It means separating your own emotions from the process. It means when the other side comes off and says something that you think is outrageous, not blowing up immediately, but sitting back. Okay, let's sit down. Let's walk, resume this later, thinking it through. And so that's, sort of any key word that I would say is, or key phrase for this is just, not trusting your gut instinct, because a lot of times that's where your own prejudices, stereotypes, analysis of, what the other person is doing, filters in. So you have to separate that from your business goal.
Oh, that's interesting, because there are those who argue the other way, right? That in fact, you and I have talked about Malcolm Gladwell, and
Right.
he has the book Blink, right, where he
Right.
says,
Yeah.
no, trust your gut, but I guess not in this context, is what you're saying.
Yeah, and it's that's
Yeah,
actually thinking about Malcolm. Yeah, he kind of comes back in some ways, though, but takes a different tack in talking to strangers, in that he's going through why, when you're dealing with people outside of your own culture, that you have to be, make sure that you're not misunderstanding. He goes through a lot of everything, examples from what's going on today in terms of our, racial issues, to miscommunications, to things like Neville Chamberlain and Hitler, any sort of things. And one of the interesting things he has there, and I recommend this book if the topic interests you. But actually, I recommend the audiobook, because he does it like a podcast. It's really fascinating to listen to. Is that he comes off with the summation at the end. He goes through a study where they look at what do facial expressions mean in other cultures. And the only one that was sort of really universal was a smile. And all the rest of them showing anger, upset, agreement, disagreement, so forth, really had cultural variations to them. And so his was saying, okay, take that point, sort of filter that in when you're talking to people with different cultural backgrounds.
Wow. So not really, except for that, everything else has to be sort of considered more carefully than.
Yeah. And I don't have any answer. And, and it's with all of these, I'm doing some, quote, stereotypes too. Within any one culture, there's your bell curve of, reactions and so forth, say on saying being interactiveness or ability to talk with, friendliness or whatever. Well, one culture may be here in the bell curve and the other one here at the bell curve and so forth. It doesn't mean that there aren't individuals at these extremes there that overlap. So it's a complicated process. It requires thought. I've made mistakes, and you will make mistakes in doing this. So it's a question of not doing them. I do want to point out there that this really good book, it's the only one that I sort of keep on my bookshelf these days, one of two books, is by Kiss Bauer, Shake Hands. And it actually has case studies for 60 different countries, talking about everything from a little bit of history to cultural do's and don'ts to negotiating styles. So it's a good thing, if you have a new client from, say, Thailand, and you're not as familiar with it, you look up Thailand, you can read through that and get an idea of some of the things that you should be aware of when you are doing your negotiations, your initial outreach. So.
Interesting. And this actually gets to a question that's posted in the chat, which I think, and we've put the link to that book in the chat there if people are interested. But I was looking into this book yesterday after we talked about it, and I noticed that it had run through several editions, which makes sense. And so there's a question here, or somebody says, as we've moved along in time, what changes in cultural negotiating protocols are occurring? And I guess that means not just the symbols and signs and foodways, for instance, but also the approaches, right? I imagine that they're updating this book because these changes are occurring, right?
Yeah, they are. And yeah, I think COVID has just made this such a tremendous divide at this moment. There's, we a year ago or a year and a half ago, if you said, oh, we're going to have a webinar at noon, a lot of people would be grumbling and so forth. I don't do those sort of things. Well, I think now we've learned that that's an important way to communicate. This way you can sort of see the other person for whatever other processes those are. I think that particularly in terms of communications, there's a lot better, a lot more rapid. You can get varying degrees of translations, that are, the Google Translate, much as I dislike it, but if you need to know immediately what's going on, you can do that. There are new sources of information, finance, and so forth. I would really say that the whole field of international business has really changed a lot in the past 5 years, and thus negotiating has changed. And it's been an area that's been kind of resistant to a lot of new technology developments, but now we're at a point where things are moving very quickly because of that.
Well, I guess even with technology and all the changes you just described, there are still things that just people are more comfortable with in terms of interpersonal relationships, and that's much slower to change, I would think.
Yeah, and it still comes down to international business is one that really emphasizes personal relations in the long run, much more so than we're thinking about in the US. I mean, a lot of people like to sell everything on e-commerce and never have to interact with other customers. But the fact of the matter is that to be successful in the long run, you need that human interaction.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I totally agree. So that raises another question for me. Are there implications here in what you're describing in these cross-cultural negotiations for other kinds of negotiations? And as we touched on in passing, within the US, how much of this would be useful? Like, would you have to sort of know how to read regional cultures or ethnic or anything like that?
Regional, ethnic, certainly there. I grew up in the Midwest, went to DC for school and started working there. Certainly there's a difference in style. It's in the Midwest, people are more, friendly and so forth. And the East Coast has this reputation of being sort of more get down to business and personal and so forth. That's even particularly more so in the, getting into the South. You get into other cultures, there's the US has so many different cultures, and it's again, it's understanding what is still brought over. And we have a lot of recent immigrants, and those are people who carry a lot of the same sort of archetypes, although they may become quite fluent in dealing with both of them. But it's just understanding, well, why isn't somebody reacting to me the way I expect them to react? Or they're not listening to me, or they're not being authentic. They're not looking me in the eye. Why aren't they looking me in the eye?
Right.
And so you can just got to step back and say, okay, what else is going on here? Are there other filters that are getting in the way of what it is we're trying to communicate?
It just seems like there are so many things like that to keep track of, though, right? I mean,
it's it's no question of black or white or grays. It's technicolor, and it requires a lot more information. But on the other hand, we have these wonderful little devices in our hands right now that gives us access to all the information. So,
yeah, no, that's something, I suppose. But I wonder if that kind of thing means it's we're converging or becoming more homogeneous in these things at all. Do you see anything like that?
Probably there will be that tendency over time. I noticed that among younger people across cultures. This is really true in Europe, that the cultural differences really are much smaller than they used to be because of communications, interactions. I mean, it's kind of this great cultural phenomena that some of the most popular, boy band groups are from Korea. Okay, so hey, who would have thunk that? That's but then enables everyone, particularly the younger ones, to have the sense that the world is, there's so many different groups out there, and there's different, you sort of accept them as they are, not without putting through these cultural filters as much.
Interesting. Wow. So I think, as you and I have discussed, I would love to tie this back to GGU in some way,
Yeah.
but I think what you're talking about definitely lends itself to that. How does this show up in the classes you teach? Are you able to incorporate this or talk about this
Yeah. I mean, for example, I had a larger session a couple weeks ago on negotiating, cross-cultural negotiating. And at the end, I gave them some case studies, and it was really interesting to get the differences, the reactions. We have a lot of veterans in our program, and their perspectives, for example, on international negotiating, like they have dealt with having to, for example, negotiate with a tribal chief in Afghanistan. Okay, so that gives a very different perspective. Yeah, I noticed this, or I noticed this other factor. So it's something that, yes, it really needs to be. It is incorporated into our curriculum, and it's something that's a very useful tool for everybody.
Interesting. So we have a minute or two left. So I do want to ask you, if folks have questions, by all means, now is your last chance. But this checklist that you've developed, which is at your website there, the IBA website. Can you talk about how that would help? I'm just thinking there's a lot to learn.
It's just a checklist of some questions to ask when you are going into a negotiation, and particularly cross-cultural one. But what are the sort of things? It's just that there's so many things that you have to keep in mind. Well, the checklist. What are you thinking of? Have you understood what the body language is? The roles of men and women. The kinds of stereotypes out there. The negotiating process. That's another set of checklists there. Okay, what am I expecting, and so forth. As you're doing your preparation. So these are good things to have in mind, this checklist, when you're going through doing your preparation for a negotiation, so that you're ready, you thought things through, and ready to move ahead at that point.
Wow. Okay, that's great. And so if people go to the website, I think there's a pop-up that Chris, I was just looking at that earlier.
Yeah.
All right. Well, great. Chris Lynch, I should say, because I haven't mentioned your name since the beginning. Chris Lynch is the founder of the International Business Accelerator, the IBA. And I'd encourage folks to check out the website, to take a look at these books that we've talked about here. And thanks. I mean, if your friends, or if you think you know folks who would be interested in this particular episode, we will be posting it on the GGU YouTube channel as soon as we can. Chris, thanks so much for talking to us about what you've been working on. This is really interesting.
Good. No, glad to do it. Glad to do it. It's Golden Gate is such an interesting place to be a professor at, and so many different backgrounds and so forth. So this is a great place for me to present this kind of my own experience and what I've learned over the years.
I think it would be challenging in a way to have such a diverse group of students who would all see this in their own unique ways too, though, wouldn't they? I mean, challenging in a good way. I don't mean like, oh, forget it, you're not going to do it, but
yeah.
Yeah, that sounds like a great experience. All right, well, Chris, again, thanks very much, and folks, thanks for coming, and we'll be back with another episode of GGU Presents really soon. All right, take care, everyone. See you soon.